Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The title of today's talk, which is this the 24th
Yeah.
of March, 2021, Strategic Manipulators. And if you want to know why we would call this strategic manipulators, we want you to just take a look at the latest news. And then we'll go backwards and we'll kind of look at how the poor American public is manipulated in the news. First of all, the subject strategic manipulators. If you look at the last 2 days, only thing you've seen in the news is what we might call the thing up in Boulder, Denver. Is that Denver? Well, Colorado. It's either Boulder, Denver, or which one? Not Denver. Well, it's right outside of, it's about 30 miles from Denver, maybe 40. This was an attack on a grocery store, and it's supposed to be 10 people killed. Okay, the guy is said to be Syrian or something like that. But 2 days, 3 days before, during last week's period, we had an attack in Atlanta. And in Atlanta is supposed to be maybe 8 people, 6 women, and maybe 2 men. And they were supposed to be of Asian origin. Okay, that dominated the news. And it was garnering sympathy from all the people, from the people of the United States. It was garnering sympathy. Now, let us remind ourselves that the Asian community, not the white community, if we even look at Black Lives Matter, if you notice the number of Asian participants would always be very low. Because the Asian, that include the Chinese and even Filipinos and what have you. Then they call some South Pacific citizens, and of course Chinese, Japanese. When we had trouble in the United States, usually like in LA and the riots or the rebellion of '92, you would see, if you ever saw pictures of the Koreans in their stores, they had AR-15 stacked up. I mean, it was serious, okay? And Koreatown is quite a ways, it's in LA also, it's quite a bit a ways from South Central. In fact, it's on the other side of town. In LA, it's 457 square miles, except for Oklahoma City, which has 600 square miles, but it's not packed like LA. LA would be technically one of the biggest cities in the United States, because New York City is only 257 square miles. San Francisco, believe it or not, is 44 square miles. I mean, it's packed in there. But anyway, today we want to talk about strategic manipulation. We're going to start from the center, go up, and then we'll be going back and forth in this talk. First of all, a few days ago, all you could hear in the news was the Asian community. I mean, and this is not just happening, this has been growing all along. Because if you listen to Donald Trump, Kung Flu and all of that stuff, he did something that hasn't happened since the Japanese internment during World War II. Japanese internment during World War II, well, they put all the Japanese in what they call concentration camps. And they put them up in the mountains in Colorado and Oregon, well, all them places. Except for, by the end of the war, they let one Japanese group come out of the detention camps. That was the most, I think it was 351st or something like that. It's the most decorated soldiers in World War II. The Japanese Americans, they didn't let them go fight the Japanese, they sent them to Europe to fight the Germans. They're the most, it was called them Buddha heads, they was the most decorated group of people in the US military during the Second World War. Even above the poor African American, above white folks, above everybody, Japanese. They took them out of internment camps. Their parents were in internment camps in the United States. Not Italian Americans, not German Americans, only Japanese Americans. So, whether it's the Vietnamese boat people, whether it's Chinese immigrants, now Chinese immigrants, boy, they had it bad. But they kept a low profile, kept their mouth shut. You know, the Chinese laundryman syndrome from way back, oh, bossy, bossy. But all the time, in my class 1956, Barbara Cone, which the Chinese had a store up on the corner, that was common in California at that time. She won the spelling bee and everything, you know. So that part of the Asian influence was keep your mouth shut, keep your head low, and gather all the money you can. And that's what they did. And up till a few years ago, the Chinese pushed the curve at the universities up so high, they stopped, I think they might have, I don't know whether they stopped letting them in or made it kind of difficult. Because all they did was study. And they pushed the curve, you know, up so high that they ran white people crazy. The white people were very slow compared to Chinese. And then we had Filipinos, we call them Asians also. Filipinos, up to 1946, all the history books referred to the Philippine colonies. So the Philippines was a colony of the United States. But they fought in World War II. In 1946, they got their liberation. But they never paid them for the guerrilla warfare they did against the Japanese. Anyway, so the Asian has a certain mentality. They was trying to say that this guy was a sex-craved maniac or something, right? And they wouldn't even call it a hate crime. I don't even think they've called it a hate. They don't call it a hate crime.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen any headlines yet.
Not quite. So the point is that up until 3 days ago, all you heard in the news was about this Asian, Chinese Kung Fu oppression, and the Asians for the first time are out in the street.
Right.
All the Asians, they out in the street, and they challenging the U.S. There's a lot of white folks with them now. A lot of those people that are slow, like in California, they were killing, and the people that were attacking them in California was black people. See, the Asians are like, all the Chinese places, Yum Yums, everything work right here. A lot of people don't particularly like that. And a lot of people don't like the attitude that Asians have against blacks. Niggas are shiftless and lazy, and they don't pay any attention to what Europeans did to them in China. No Chinese and dogs allowed in their parks. In China, that's a sign, no Chinese and dogs allowed. They're talking about Hong Kong, talking about we want liberation. You didn't have no liberation when the Chinamans, when the British had you, right? The only liberation you got is now, when the Chinamans got you, because you couldn't go. You go back in the old days, no Chinese, no dogs allowed. Common signs, no niggas and no dogs allowed. No da 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 da. The point I'm getting at is, until 3 days ago, before this shooting up in Colorado, right? The Asians was coming out. We're tired. And old dumb Don was talking about Kung Flu and all of that, right? He was insulting the people. And so the people finally, when I say Asians, that means Koreans, Chinese, all of them. You see at the rallies they had around the U.S., all of them were taking turns speaking, and maybe they had a main spokesman. But this is the first time, one of the first times, you've seen in the American press and in the public, people from China coming out and standing up for themselves. Or let's call it Asians. The other thing is, the meeting China had last week, with the Americans in Alaska, it was a disaster for Americans. Disaster. They come in talking jive, the Chinese said, hold it on, boy, y'all ain't gonna get away with that. And they started running and they got shocked. They were shocked because the Chinese was backing themselves up, was supporting themselves. And they didn't have a Chinese laundryman attitude. In the last few years, there's been a total change in China. The Chinese, first Deng Xiaoping, it was Chairman Mao, Guangwu Fang, and then people, then under Chairman Mao, it was a strong presence. But under Deng Xiaoping, he was the premier of China. He had a low profile. He said, we'll slip up on the boss man, keep our mouth shut. And they had a serious policy. If the U.S. invested in Africa and everything, they wouldn't have no transfer of technology. Chinese said 40 years ago or more, whatever you bring here, you're going to have to bring the technology with it so we can make it ourselves. They didn't say that. Plus the Chinese was kind of like y'all wouldn't remember the old days of cassettes and DVDs. Remember if you bought copies of DVDs up till 2 years ago? And those plastic things? Yeah, it was all from China. I bought all of my movies from China. Tony up in New York, Tony. Anyway, so let's look at the picture. All the things related to Orientals, they had the Chinese Exclusionary Act that up until a certain time in the U.S., they needed them to help build the railroads and all of that. When the railroads was finished in the 30s, last century, they stopped them. They had the Chinese Exclusionary Act. They had no Mexican Exclusionary Act, Japanese Exclusionary Act, although they was probably on it. Italian, nobody excluded, y'all are excluded. But the Chinese Exclusionary Act meant that they didn't want any more Chinese to come here to America. That's all, remember in the 30s and all of that. Okay, let's try to get up to today. Right now, the Kung Flu virus and this and that, they're trying to blame everything on China. The Chinese say, you Americans, military brought that over here yourself, which is very close to reality. I wouldn't go doubting it a whole lot. Then it got away, and when they loosed it in China, the Chinese jumped on it. Remember just last year? No more. The Koreans jumped on it right away. And in America, boy, that virus, you talk about suicide, that's what the Americans, they made that thing, and it's killing Americans. Okay, but anyway, the latest news. In Atlanta, you would hear a few days ago about this Caucasian man had a sex habit, and he, poor guy, they never called it Oriental or Chinese, type of racism. They haven't even up to today. Then the Chinese are out. They're getting all of these, you can see on TV, all these demonstrations all over America. Visually seeing Chinese, Koreans, all Asians, and everybody except Southeast Asians, that is Indians. All the rest of them, Pacific Islanders, Guam, everywhere, all of them working as one team. Nobody had ever unified all of those people under one banner because they all had a different team.
Right. Yeah.
They were all divided. Whatever if they had a rebellious group inside of China, well, most of the people would be bootlickers for the United States, but it would be that communist influence, because the Chinese communists always stood up for, it was a century of oppression, how the Europeans carved up China, right, and did it. They got a thing about that. They're just getting over that. Now here come the U.S. Soon as China and Kung Flu and the Orientals are getting all that attention, bam, they have a shootout up there in Colorado, right? They have a shootout. 10 people dead, right? And what do you hear about the police that was killed? Oh, he just a nice man. So he probably was, no problem. But that, in the last 2 days, wiped the Chinese out of the news. Wiped the Orientals out of the news. Just think about it. It dropped into second place real quick. The meetings in Alaska with the Chinese, the U.S. came in talking crazy. The Chinese jumped up and said, no, boy, you ain't doing that. And then all this stuff about Muslim oppression in China, all that's coming out, that it technically don't exist. Basically, the population was 5 million Uyghurs several years back. Now it's 11 million. You couldn't do that in China. So they had a cap on Chinese birth rate, one child only. Now people did a little bit undercover, but not a whole lot. Because if you got a child undercover, you don't get no Social Security, you don't get nothing because you can't register. They couldn't register. Now they'll probably drop that. The point is, this United States of America is totally discombobulated. Totally. It's so bad. Step back and look at the United States of America. Just an overview. All last last summer, Black Lives Matter. White people out there participating. So it almost looked like White Lives Matter, right? That's what it was. We was out there with them. We was out there participating. The whole world, because the Chinese set it up there in Alaska. What are you talking about? Oppression. You got Black Lives Matter. You got this. Look how you treating immigrants down on the border. What are you talking about? Americans were shocked. They're just shocked as they can be. Okay, but when you watch the news, this killing and a shooting, 10 people dead up there in Colorado, it reminds us of maintaining vigilance on the news, producing the trend. Let's say the Kung Flu virus in China don't have nobody, it's got 3 times as many people of America. There ain't nobody dying. Maybe 20 or 30 here and there. But they got close to 600,000 now in America, way over half a billion. Here, it's rolling. And now, the last few days, it's picking up. Okay, if you go back some time and you look at the so-called killings and murders of poor children all up in the north there, the elementary school children.
Oh, yeah, I know. Sandy Hook?
Sandy Hook and others. Now, they bring this clown, what's his name, out to say, oh, that didn't really happen.
Oh,
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Jones.
What's his name?
It was Alex Jones, right?
Jones.
Alex Jones, that man's crazy. He's a government agent, you can tell, because that really happened. That really happened. You can't fake that many, people standing out there crying like that. You can fake how it happened and lie to the people, but you can't take the little children who's here today and they're gone tomorrow. Where do they go? They get zapped up somewhere, right? Their mothers and fathers gave them away, right? This is the point. There's a big conspiracy in the United States, it's not even a conspiracy, to control the mass media, to control the headlines. And you can see in America how the headlines